I still remember the sound of silence more than anything else. Not the quiet kind that brings peace, but the kind that sits heavy in a house that was once supposed to echo with laughter, tiny footsteps, and the soft calling of a voice that never came. I used to imagine it so clearly that it almost felt real. A small room painted in warm colors, toys scattered across the floor, tiny shoes near the door, and a soft cry in the middle of the night that I would wake up to with a strange kind of happiness, because it would mean I was needed. It would mean I was a mother in the way I had always dreamed. But dreams have a way of turning into something else when life doesn't agree with them. There were years when I measured time not by days or months, but by waiting for something that everyone else seemed to receive so easily, so naturally, as if it were a simple breath. I watched people around me step into motherhood like it was a door already open for them, and I smiled for them. I truly did. I held their children, rocked them gently, kissed their soft heads, and told myself I was happy. And in those moments, I believed my own smile. But when I returned home, I would place my hands on my own arms and feel the emptiness more deeply than any words could explain. It wasn't just the absence of a child. It was the absence of what I thought my life would become. It was the echo of something that never arrived. I learned to hide it well. I learned how to laugh at the right moments, how to ask the right questions about other people's children, how to look interested when someone spoke about sleepless nights and school runs and tiny milestones. I became skilled at nodding at the right times, at pretending that my chest wasn't tightening every time a child reached out for their mother. Inside, though, something kept breaking in small, invisible ways. There were nights when I would sit by the window long after everyone else in the house had gone to sleep. The world outside would continue as if nothing was missing. Cars would pass. Lights would flicker in distant homes. Somewhere a baby would cry and then be comforted. Somewhere else, a child would laugh in their sleep. And I would sit there, holding my own silence like it was the only thing I had left. I remember how I used to talk to the quiet, not out loud at first, just thoughts that I pretended were enough. I would tell myself that maybe timing mattered, that maybe life was preparing something I couldn't see yet, that maybe pain was just a passage and not a destination. But years have a way of testing hope. And slowly, hope begins to sit differently in the heart. It doesn't disappear, it just becomes heavier, less bright, more fragile. There were moments I avoided without even realizing I was avoiding them. Baby showers. Family gatherings where questions floated casually in the air. Conversations that began with laughter and ended with glances that lingered too long. I became good at stepping away before the question could be asked. But I could always feel it coming. That pause. That shift in tone. That careful choosing of words. As if everyone had agreed, silently, to avoid touching a wound they could already see but never truly understand. And still I smiled. Because smiling became easier than explaining. There is something strange about pain when it stays too long. It stops being sharp. It becomes something else, something constant. Like a background noise you stop noticing until it suddenly grows loud again. For me, it grew loud in the most unexpected places. In grocery stores, where I saw mothers lifting children into carts. In parks where small hands reached upward without hesitation. In ordinary streets, where life moved forward in ways I felt frozen from. Each moment reminded me of what I did not have, even when I tried so hard not to think about it. And yet, I never stopped showing up for others. I never stopped being the one who smiled, who comforted, who held other people's happiness without letting them see my own quiet fracture. People would often say I was strong. But strength is not always what it looks like from the outside. Sometimes strength is just learning how to carry something silently, because there is no other choice. There was a particular evening I still remember clearly. The air felt softer than usual, like the world was trying to pretend everything was fine. I had been invited to a small gathering, nothing special. Just families talking, children playing, laughter spilling across rooms. I almost didn't go. But I went anyway. And I sat there, watching a child run toward their mother with pure trust in every step. The way they were caught in an embrace so natural, so instinctive, it almost felt like breathing. Something inside me tightened, in a way I had learned to recognize too well. I looked away before anyone noticed. And I smiled again. That smile was not joy, it was survival. Later that night, when I returned home, I didn't turn on the lights immediately. I stood in the dark for a long time, letting the silence surround me fully. It felt honest in a way nothing else did. And in that darkness, I finally allowed myself to admit something I had avoided for years. I was tired of pretending. Not because I hated others' happiness, but because I had forgotten what my own was supposed to feel like. Still, even in that moment, I did not cry loudly. I never learned how. My pain was never loud. It was always quiet, folded into corners of my life where no one thought to look. I sat down slowly, placed my hands in my lap, and stared at nothing. And I thought about all the versions of myself I had once believed I would become. The version who would wake up to small voices. The version who would pack lunches and tie tiny shoes. The version who would be called mother without hesitation. All those versions felt like they belonged to someone else now. But deep inside, something still remained. Not hope exactly. Something smaller. Something stubborn. Something that refused to fully disappear. And I didn't know it yet, but that small, stubborn part of me was about to begin something I never expected. Something that would slowly change the shape of everything I thought my life had already decided. For now, though, all I had was the silence again. And the quiet beginning of a story I had not yet learned how to tell. The days after that evening did not feel different on the surface. Life continued in its usual way, as if nothing inside me had shifted. I still woke up at the same time. I still prepared my tea the same way. I still responded to messages, smiled at conversations, and moved through hours that looked ordinary from the outside. But inside, something had changed its position. It was not loud. It did not demand attention. It simply stayed there, like a thought that refuses to leave once it has entered. I began noticing things I had trained myself to ignore. Small things. The way a child's laughter could fill an entire space without effort. The way mothers instinctively reached out even before their children stumbled. The way families formed circles without even realizing they were completing something. I used to pass through those moments without feeling too much. Now I felt everything. It was as if something in me had become more sensitive, more aware, like a wound that had finally stopped numbing itself. And yet I still smiled, because smiling was still easier than explaining. But at night, the silence changed its shape again. It no longer felt like only absence. It started feeling like questions I had never answered. Why not me? Why had life passed me by in this one way that seemed so simple for everyone else? I tried not to think in that direction, but thoughts do not always listen. They come quietly, sit beside you, and wait until you finally turn toward them. I began remembering things I had long buried under routine. Appointments I had stopped attending. Conversations I had ended too quickly. Moments where hope had slowly been replaced by hesitation. I had convinced myself at different points that acceptance meant peace. But acceptance, I realized, can sometimes become another form of silence. A silence that does not heal, only hides. One morning, while standing near a window, I saw a woman outside holding a child's hand. Nothing unusual about it. It was such a normal scene that it should not have affected me. But something about the way the child looked up, completely trusting, completely safe, stopped me. I stayed there longer than I intended. My tea grew cold in my hand. And I realized something uncomfortable. I was no longer just observing life. I was feeling separated from it. That thought stayed with me longer than I wanted. Days turned into weeks, and I began noticing how carefully I had constructed my life around avoiding certain spaces. I would choose seats that faced away from families in cafes. I would arrive late to gatherings where children might be present. I would leave early when conversations drifted too close to topics I wasn't ready to hold. It wasn't intentional cruelty toward myself. It was protection. At least, that is what I told myself. But protection, if it lasts too long, begins to feel like confinement. There was one afternoon that stayed with me more than the rest. I had gone out simply to clear my mind. The air was warm, the streets active, life moving forward in its usual rhythm. I passed by a small park. I almost walked past it. But then I stopped. I don't know why. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was something deeper than that. Inside, children were playing freely. Some were running. Some were sitting in small groups. Some were calling out to their parents who watched from benches with soft, tired smiles. And then I saw it again. That instinctive closeness between mother and child. That effortless connection that needed no explanation. I stood near the entrance for a long time, unnoticed by anyone. Not because I wanted to intrude, but because I could not move away immediately. Something in my chest tightened, not sharply but deeply. Not pain exactly. More like recognition of something I had always wanted but never held. A little boy ran past me laughing, nearly stumbling. A woman quickly reached out and caught him before he fell. The moment was so natural it almost felt like air itself. And I felt my breath catch. Not from sadness alone. From distance. From awareness. From the quiet understanding that life had placed me just slightly outside of something I had always assumed I would naturally belong to. I turned away before anyone could notice my expression. And I walked back home in silence. That night, I did not try to distract myself. I did not turn on noise. I did not reach for conversation. I simply sat with myself. And for the first time in a long time, I allowed the thought to fully form without pushing it away. Maybe I had spent too long waiting in one place emotionally. Maybe waiting had slowly become my identity without me noticing. It wasn't bitterness that came next. It was something more complicated. A quiet questioning of what my life had become while I was still trying to make something else happen. And yet, even in that uncertainty, something else began to stir. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was there. A thought that did not feel like despair. A thought that felt like movement. Like maybe life had not ended in the place I thought it had paused. Maybe there was still something ahead that I had not allowed myself to see. I did not understand it yet, but it made me restless in a different way. Not broken, not defeated, just not finished. And that was new. For the first time in a long while, the silence inside me did not feel entirely like an ending. It felt like it was holding something back, something I had not yet reached, something that had not yet decided to reveal itself. The restlessness did not leave me the next day. It stayed, quietly woven into everything I did, like a thread that refused to be pulled out once it had settled into fabric. I tried to ignore it at first. That is what I had always done with anything uncomfortable. I would place it somewhere behind routine, behind responsibility, behind the carefully maintained image of being fine. But this time, ignoring it did not work the same way. Because it was not pain that I was carrying now. It was awareness. And awareness does not fade easily once it arrives. I began to notice how often I paused during simple tasks, how my thoughts drifted even in the middle of ordinary conversations, how I found myself staring at things longer than necessary, as if searching for meaning hidden in details I had never cared about before. A spoon resting beside a cup. A child's drawing pinned near a store window. A mother adjusting her child's scarf against a light wind. Each moment felt slightly louder than it should have. As if life had lowered its voice, just enough for me to finally hear what I had been missing all along. I started walking more than usual. Not for exercise. Not for purpose. Just movement. Movement helped me avoid sitting too long with my own thoughts, because sitting too long meant listening too closely. And listening too closely meant feeling too much. One afternoon, I found myself near a community center I had passed many times before but never entered. It wasn't planned. I simply stopped walking when I saw people going in and out with small children, holding paper crafts and colorful drawings. There was laughter spilling out from inside. Soft, honest, unfiltered. I stood outside for a long time. Long enough that someone might have thought I was waiting for someone. But I was. I was just standing between two versions of myself. The one that had learned to accept distance, and the one that still wondered what closeness might have felt like. Eventually, I stepped inside. Not because I decided to, but because something in me quietly moved before I could think too much. The inside was warm in a way I wasn't prepared for. Not physically warm, emotionally warm. The kind of place where noise did not feel overwhelming, but alive. Children were gathered around small tables, working on simple activities. Caregivers moved gently between them, offering encouragement, adjusting papers, wiping small hands without urgency. It was not chaotic. It was structured care, something I had only ever observed from the outside before. I stood near the entrance, unsure of where to place myself. A few people looked up briefly, then returned to what they were doing. No one questioned my presence. That alone felt strange. I slowly walked further in, stopping near a wall where drawings were displayed. Most of them were simple. Houses, families, bright suns, trees that looked slightly too large for their pages. But what struck me was not the drawings themselves. It was the certainty behind them. The certainty that they belonged. That they were part of something. I felt something tighten in my chest again, but this time I did not step away immediately. Instead, I stayed. And I let myself feel it fully. Not as punishment. Not as regret. But as truth. A caregiver nearby noticed me eventually. Not with suspicion. With calm acknowledgement. A quiet question without words. Are you here for someone? I hesitated, then shook my head slightly. No explanation followed. None was needed. Instead, she simply nodded and returned to her work. That simple acceptance unsettled me more than I expected. Because I had prepared myself for discomfort, for awkwardness, for questions I didn't want to answer. But what I received instead was neutrality. And neutrality, I realized, can sometimes feel more exposing than judgment. I stayed longer than I intended. Sitting on a bench near the back, just observing. Children came and went from the room in small groups. Some showed their work proudly. Some ran to the side for water. Some leaned briefly into adults' arms before returning to activity. It was ordinary life. And yet, it felt like a world I had been standing outside of without fully realizing it. At one point, a small child dropped a drawing near where I was sitting. I picked it up instinctively. It was simple, just shapes and colors that didn't form anything specific. When I handed it back, the child smiled briefly, then ran off without hesitation. That moment should have been small, but it stayed with me. Because of how effortless it was. Because of how naturally it existed, without asking anything from me. I left after a while. Not suddenly. Not emotionally overwhelmed. Just quietly. As if I had visited a place that was both familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. Walking back outside, the air felt different. Not changed. Just more noticeable. I realized I had been holding my breath in ways I hadn't recognized before. That evening, I did not return to silence in the same way I had before. Something had shifted slightly inside it. The silence was still there, but it was no longer empty. It was layered now. With observation. With memory. With questions I could no longer ignore. And beneath all of it something else began to form. Not hope in a loud sense, not sudden optimism, but a quieter thing. A willingness to stop turning away so quickly. A willingness to stay present, even when presence was uncomfortable. I didn't understand where it would lead. But for the first time, I didn't assume it would lead nowhere. And that, more than anything, was what made me realize something important. My story had not stopped. It had only been waiting for me to finally step back into it. After that day, I stopped moving through life in the same automatic way. Not completely, not suddenly, but enough that I noticed the difference. There is a strange shift that happens when you begin to see your own life from slightly outside yourself. The routines are still there, the responsibilities are still there, but something in the way you experience them changes. It becomes harder to pretend you are untouched by your own thoughts. I found myself thinking about the community center more than I expected. Not in an obsessive way, in a reflective way. Like my mind had opened a door it had previously kept locked, and now it kept glancing toward it without deciding whether to fully enter again. At home, I tried to return to my usual rhythm. Tea in the morning, simple meals, small tasks that filled time without demanding too much attention. But even ordinary things started to feel slightly different. Not because they had changed, but because I had. I noticed how quiet my house actually was. Not peaceful quiet, structured quiet. A quiet that had learned not to expect interruption. I had lived with it for so long that I used to believe it was normal. Now it felt more noticeable, more defined, like a space that had been carefully arranged around absence. And yet, I still did not break down. I still did not suddenly become someone different. Life does not shift in dramatic scenes the way people sometimes imagine. It shifts in pauses, in hesitations, in small moments where you choose to sit with something instead of turning away from it immediately. One morning, I found myself standing longer than usual near a mirror. Not examining myself in detail, just observing. There was nothing unusual about what I saw. But my thoughts were louder than my reflection. I realized I had spent years preparing myself to be okay with something that I was never fully okay with. That realization did not hurt in the way pain usually does. It settled more quietly, like something that had always been true, but had never been acknowledged directly. Later that day, I walked again. Not toward anywhere specific. Just movement. The kind that keeps thoughts from becoming too heavy in one place. I passed by familiar streets, familiar sounds, familiar faces that existed briefly in my awareness, and then disappeared again. But my mind kept returning to something I had seen at the center. The way children moved so freely between activity and connection. The way adults guided without forcing. The way presence itself seemed to be enough there. I had always thought of my life as something that had been paused. But now I started to wonder if it had simply taken a different shape than the one I had expected. That thought did not bring comfort immediately. It brought resistance. Because accepting that idea meant letting go of something I had carried for a very long time. The version of life I had been waiting for. And letting go of long-held expectations is not a simple act. It feels like loosening your grip on something you are not entirely ready to release. That evening, I returned to the center again. Not because I planned to, but because my steps simply took me there. This time, I did not stand at the entrance for long. I went in more easily, as if my hesitation had lessened its hold slightly. The same atmosphere greeted me. Soft movement, gentle sound, the rhythm of activity that did not demand anything from me. I sat in a different place this time, closer to the side, less hidden than before, still not fully part of anything, but no longer completely separate either. A caregiver passed by again. She recognized me, though we had never spoken properly. This time, There was a small, almost unnoticeable acknowledgement in her expression. Not curiosity, not expectation, just recognition of presence. I realized how rare that feeling had become for me. To be seen without being defined. To exist in a space without explanation. I stayed longer this time. Long enough to stop counting how long I had been there. Long enough for my body to settle into the space instead of resisting it. At one point, I found myself watching a group activity closely. Children were working together on something simple, passing materials back and forth, reacting to small successes with quiet excitement. There was no pressure in the room. No urgency. Just participation. And something about that struck me deeply. Because I realized how often I had been living with urgency inside myself. Urgency to understand my life. Urgency to accept it. Urgency to move past feelings that were never fully processed. But here, nothing demanded that kind of speed. I left later than before. When I stepped outside, the air felt slightly cooler. The world beyond the center felt louder again, as if I had briefly stepped into a softer version of reality and now returned to something sharper. But I did not feel as disconnected from it as I used to. That was new. Over the next few days, something subtle changed in my routine. I did not stop my usual life, but I added small interruptions to it. Short walks that ended near places I had avoided before. Moments of sitting without distraction. Allowing thoughts to complete themselves instead of cutting them off halfway. It was uncomfortable at first. Because silence inside your mind is not always peaceful when you are not used to hearing it fully. But slowly, it became less overwhelming. More honest. And in that honesty, I began to understand something I had not been ready to see earlier. My life had not been empty in the way I had labeled it. It had been full of different kinds of experiences I had not allowed myself to value properly. Care for others. Connection in unexpected places. Small moments of meaning I had overlooked because they did not match the picture I had once imagined. That realization did not erase the grief, but it began to shift its weight. It was no longer only something I carried as loss. It was becoming something I could observe without being consumed by it. And that shift, though quiet, was significant, because it meant I was no longer standing still inside my pain. I was beginning to move through it, not away from it. Through it, the days after that felt like a slow adjustment rather than a change. Nothing dramatic happened. No sudden answers arrived. No life-altering moment appeared to announce a new direction. And yet, everything felt slightly repositioned, as if my inner world had shifted a few inches to the left, and I was still learning how to stand within it. I continued going to the center. Not every day. Not with a fixed routine. But often enough that it no longer felt like a coincidence when I arrived there. There was something grounding about the space now. Not because it solved anything, but because it allowed me to exist without explanation. That was still new to me. In most places in my life, I had learned how to be understood through context. A role. A response. A performance of normalcy. But here, I could simply be present without needing to define why. And slowly, that started to matter more than I expected. I began to notice details I had missed before. The way children arrived with different expressions each day, some excited, some shy, some quietly observant. The way adults interacted with them not as distant supervisors, but as steady presence. The way the environment held both structure and softness at the same time. It wasn't perfection. It was something more human than that. And that made it harder to ignore what it stirred in me. Because I started to see not just what I had missed in life, but what I had assumed was no longer available to me in any form. One afternoon, I stayed longer than usual. The room was quieter than before, the activity winding down into smaller groups and slower movement. I found myself sitting near a table where leftover materials were being gathered. Not participating, not observing closely, just existing in the space as it softened. A caregiver passed by and placed a few items back into storage nearby. She didn't speak, but there was a brief moment where her presence felt close enough that I could have said something if I wanted to. I didn't, and she didn't ask. That balance of non-demanding presence stayed with me afterward, because it reminded me that not every connection needs to begin with explanation. Some begin with simply being allowed to stay. When I finally stood to leave, I noticed something I had not paid attention to before. A small board near the exit where simple messages were displayed. Notes, drawings, short expressions from visitors and participants. Some were clearly from children, short, uneven writing, simple gratitude, small observations about their day. Others were from adults, slightly more structured but still personal. I found myself reading them slowly, not searching for anything specific, just absorbing the tone of them. There was something unguarded about those messages, something I was not used to seeing in written form, a kind of openness that did not feel performative. It made me uneasy in a way I could not immediately name. Not because it was wrong, but because it highlighted how often I had lived carefully around my own feelings. That evening, after returning home, I did something I had not done in a long time. I sat without distraction. No background noise. No task occupying my attention. Just stillness. At first, it felt unnatural. My mind tried to fill the space immediately, reaching for thoughts, memories, interpretations of the day. But I didn't interrupt it. I let it continue. And slowly, beneath all the surface thoughts, something deeper started to become visible. Not a single realization. Not a sudden understanding. But a pattern. A recognition of how long I had been living in negotiation with my own emotions. Allowing some. Avoiding others. Labeling certain feelings as too heavy to fully examine. And in doing so, I had created a version of myself that functioned well externally, but remained partially distant internally. That realization was not painful in a sharp way. It was more like noticing a structure you had lived inside without fully seeing its design. The question that followed was not immediate. It arrived later. Quietly. What would it mean to stop negotiating so constantly with myself? Not to force change. Not to demand healing. But to allow experience without filtering it, first through fear or expectation. I didn't have an answer. But for the first time, I didn't immediately reject the question either. The next day, I returned again. The routine of the center had begun to feel familiar, though I was still not part of its structure. Just a recurring presence. A witness to something ongoing. As I sat down, I noticed a small shift in myself. I was no longer scanning the space for emotional reactions as intensely as before. I was simply observing. That alone felt like progress, though I didn't fully define it that way. During one of the activities, I found myself watching a child struggle briefly with something simple. A moment of frustration, quickly resolved with gentle guidance from someone nearby. The shift from struggle to relief happened so quickly, it almost seemed unremarkable. But I found myself holding onto it longer than I expected, because I realized how often I had believed that certain emotional states were permanent. That grief, once established, stayed unchanged. That absence, once formed, remained fixed. But here, I was watching constant small transitions, not erasing difficulty, but moving through it. And that challenged something I had carried for a long time. I left earlier that day, not because I needed to escape anything, but because I felt full in a different way. Not overwhelmed, not empty, just full of observation. On the walk home, I noticed the world outside again. Cars passing, people talking, The ordinary rhythm of life, continuing without awareness of the small shifts happening inside me. And for the first time, I didn't feel completely separated from it. I felt adjacent to it, but not excluded. That distinction mattered more than I expected. Because exclusion had been a quiet background feeling for years, even when I was surrounded by people. That night, I wrote nothing. I said nothing. But I allowed myself to sit with a thought that had been slowly forming without pressure. Maybe my life was not defined by what had not happened. Maybe it was also defined by what I had not yet allowed myself to see within what had happened. It wasn't resolution. It wasn't clarity. But it was openness. And in that openness, something very small began to form. Not hope in the way I once imagined it, but something steadier. A willingness to continue without needing immediate answers. And for now, that was enough to keep me moving forward. The willingness I had begun to feel did not arrive with certainty. It arrived quietly, and it stayed fragile. There were moments when I still slipped back into older ways of thinking without even noticing. Moments when the weight of absence returned suddenly, not as a constant ache, but as a passing wave that could still take my breath away if I wasn't prepared for it. Healing, I was beginning to understand, is not a straight path. It is a pattern of returning and relearning. Some days I felt more open than others. Some days I felt like I was standing in two versions of myself at the same time. One that was slowly learning to engage with life again, and one that still carried the long silence of everything that had not happened. But something important had changed. I no longer ran from that contradiction as quickly as before. I allowed both parts to exist without forcing one to disappear. The center continued to be part of my life, but it no longer felt like an escape or a replacement. It had become something closer to a mirror, not reflecting answers, but reflecting presence. And sometimes, that is enough to begin understanding yourself differently. One afternoon, I arrived earlier than usual. The sunlight outside was softer, stretching across the floor in long shapes that shifted slowly as people moved through the space. I sat in my usual corner, observing without expectation. There was a calmness in the room that day that I had not noticed before. Not silence, but balance. The kind of atmosphere where even small sounds felt intentional rather than chaotic. I found myself watching longer without emotional interruption. Not because I was detached, but because I was no longer reacting to everything internally at the same intensity. That alone felt like a change I could not ignore. At some point, I noticed a group activity forming near the center of the room. Nothing complicated. Just shared interaction, simple coordination, small exchanges that required attention but not pressure. I stayed where I was, but my awareness drifted toward it naturally. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I was outside of it in a painful way. I felt like I was simply not inside it yet. That difference might seem small, but internally, it was significant. Because exclusion feels permanent. But distance can change. Later, as the activity continued, I noticed something else. Not in the room, but inside myself. A subtle loosening. Not emotional release in a dramatic sense, but a softening of tension I had been carrying for so long that I had stopped noticing it was there. It wasn't grief disappearing. It was grief shifting its position, no longer pressing so tightly against everything else. That evening, as I walked home, I found myself thinking less about what I lacked and more about what I was beginning to notice. The shift was not dramatic, but it was consistent enough that I could no longer dismiss it as temporary. Something in my inner world was reorganizing itself, not erasing the past, but no longer allowing it to define every present moment. At home, I sat by the window again. This time, the silence felt different. Still quiet, still spacious, but no longer hollow in the same way. There was texture in it now. layers of thought that did not collapse inward as quickly. I thought about the idea of purpose, not in a grand sense, but in a quieter one. What does it mean to belong to something again? Not through expectation, but through presence. The question didn't demand an answer immediately. It simply stayed, and I allowed it to stay. Over the next few days, I returned to the center with less hesitation. Not because I had decided anything, but because my resistance had softened. There is a difference between choosing something and no longer avoiding it. I was still learning that difference. One afternoon, I noticed something that shifted my thinking again. A moment of guidance happening between an adult and a child, simple and natural, without emphasis or performance. What struck me was not the action itself, but the ease of it. The absence of hesitation. The absence of internal conflict. It reminded me that connection does not always require preparation. Sometimes it is simply response. Present response. And I realized how often I had overcomplicated even the idea of connection in my own life. Not just with others, but with myself. That realization stayed with me longer than I expected. That night, I didn't feel the familiar heaviness I had grown used to at certain hours. Instead, I felt something quieter. Awareness without pressure. And in that space, a thought formed gently. Maybe my life was not meant to be measured by what had been missing. Maybe it was also shaped by what I was still able to enter. Even after long silence, I did not rush that thought into meaning. I simply observed it. Because I was learning that not every realization needs to become immediate action. Some need time to settle before they become part of you. The following days did not bring dramatic change, but they brought consistency. And consistency, I was beginning to understand, is its own form of transformation. I still carried the past, but it no longer filled every corner of the present. And that space, small, fragile, but real, was where something new was beginning to grow. Not an ending, not a resolution, but the slow beginning of a different relationship with my own life. The space inside me that had begun to open did not stay stable all the time. Some days it expanded. Some days it tightened again. I started to understand that healing does not remove the past. It changes how close the past stands to you. And even that change takes time to settle. There were mornings when I woke up feeling almost normal, as if the weight I had carried for so long had loosened its grip overnight. I would move through the early hours with a strange lightness, noticing things I usually passed without attention. The way sunlight touched the floor, the rhythm of distant sounds, the small details of ordinary life that had once felt invisible. But there were also mornings when the silence returned heavily. Not dramatically, just enough to remind me that nothing inside me had fully disappeared. On those days, I learned not to fight it as much. I would sit with it instead, not as surrender, but as recognition. The center remained part of my rhythm. It had become less of a place I went to escape, and more of a place I went to observe myself differently. That shift mattered more than I could explain, because I was no longer entering it as someone trying to avoid pain. I was entering it as someone trying to understand presence. One afternoon, I arrived during a transition between activities. The room was in that quiet in-between state, neither busy nor empty. Just movement slowing into rest. I stood near the side for a moment before sitting, noticing how natural the environment felt to me now compared to the first time I had stepped inside. Back then, I had felt like an outsider looking into a world that did not belong to me. Now, I felt like someone who simply had not defined her place within it yet. That difference was subtle, but powerful. I sat down and allowed myself to simply observe again, not searching for emotional reaction, not analyzing, just watching. And in that stillness, I noticed something I had previously overlooked. The way attention itself was shared in the space. How care did not always look like action. Sometimes it looked like presence. Sometimes it looked like simply being near without pressure. That idea lingered in me longer than expected, because I had spent so many years believing that meaning had to be proven through visible outcomes, through roles, through expectations, through outcomes that others could recognize. But here, meaning seemed to exist in something quieter, something less defined, something I was not used to trusting. Later that day, something small happened, almost too small to name. A brief moment where someone passed nearby and acknowledged me, not in a formal way, not in a questioning way, but in a natural, passing recognition of shared space. It lasted only seconds, but it stayed with me longer than that, because I realized how rarely I had experienced acknowledgement without explanation attached to it. No question of who I was there for. No assumption. No distance disguised as politeness. Just presence meeting presence. When I left that day, I walked more slowly than usual. Not because I was tired, but because I was thinking differently. About what it means to belong somewhere without needing to justify it. That question followed me home and stayed with me through the evening. At home, I found myself sitting without turning on anything for distraction. No background sound. No immediate task. Just stillness again. But this stillness was not the same as before. It did not feel empty in the same way. It felt layered, like it contained more than it revealed immediately. I began to think about how much of my life had been shaped by waiting. Waiting for change. Waiting for resolution. Waiting for a version of life I had imagined, but never fully experienced. And I realized something quietly unsettling. Waiting had become so familiar that I had not noticed how much of my present had been shaped by it. Not in obvious ways, but in emotional posture, in how I approached days, in how I defined possibility. That realization did not bring immediate comfort, but it brought clarity. And clarity, even when uncomfortable, has a way of shifting direction inside you. The next day, I returned again, but something felt different in how I moved through the space. I was no longer scanning for emotional cues as intensely. I was no longer measuring my distance from everything around me. I was simply there. And that simply there feeling was new enough to feel significant. During one of the quieter moments, I found myself observing a child sitting alone briefly, focused on something in their hands. There was no distress, no urgency, just absorbed attention. And I noticed how quickly someone nearby eventually joined them, not interrupting, not correcting, just entering their space naturally. The transition was smooth, unforced, and it made me think about how often I had complicated even the idea of entering or being part of something. As if every form of connection required permission I had never fully granted myself. That thought stayed with me as I left. And on the walk home, I noticed something else. The world outside no longer felt entirely separate from what I was experiencing inside. There was overlap now. Not full integration, but overlap. A sense that what I was learning in one space was beginning to affect how I saw everything else. That evening, I did not search for meaning. I did not try to conclude anything. I simply allowed the day to remain unfinished in my mind. And in that unfinished state, something quietly settled. Not peace, not resolution, but a steadier form of awareness. One that did not demand immediate answers to everything it touched. And for now, that was enough to continue forward. The steadiness I had begun to feel did not make life easier. It simply made it clearer. And clarity, I was learning, comes with its own kind of weight. Because once you begin to see things without the fog of avoidance, you also begin to see how long you have been carrying certain patterns without numbing them. There were moments when I missed the old distraction of emotional distance. when everything felt blurred enough that I didn't have to examine it too closely. But I also knew I couldn't go back to that way of living fully. Something had already shifted too far inward. The center continued to be part of my rhythm, but my relationship with it kept evolving. It was no longer just a place I observed. It was becoming a place where I also observed myself. Not in a critical way, in a revealing way. One afternoon, I arrived later than usual. The space was already active, but not crowded. There was a softer rhythm in the air, as if the day had already passed its most energetic point. I sat down and noticed how easily my body adjusted now. Earlier, I used to feel tension in unfamiliar spaces without even realizing it. Now, I recognized when that tension was absent. That absence itself felt like information. During that visit, I found myself paying attention to something I had previously ignored. The transitions between interaction and rest. How easily people moved between engagement and pause without overthinking it. There was no hesitation attached to stopping. No guilt attached to resting. No pressure to constantly maintain emotional intensity. It made me reflect on how often I had been living with internal pressure that no one else was actually demanding from me. The pressure had been self-built, quietly accumulated over time. Later, I noticed a small moment near a corner of the room. Nothing significant in appearance. A simple exchange of attention between two people that didn't involve words, but still communicated understanding. It lasted only seconds, but it stayed with me, because I realized I had been underestimating the value of simple acknowledgement in my life. Not everything meaningful announces itself loudly. Some things just pass through you gently and leave a trace. When I left that day, I didn't feel heavy, but I didn't feel light either. It was something in between, a kind of emotional neutrality that didn't feel empty anymore. It felt prepared, as if something inside me was reorganizing itself slowly enough that I could finally keep up with it. On the walk home, I noticed a shift in how I was perceiving ordinary surroundings. The streets I had walked countless times no longer felt completely automatic. I was seeing details again, not because they had changed, but because my attention was no longer constantly pulled inward. At home, I sat for a long time without immediately engaging in anything. That used to feel uncomfortable. Now it felt like space. And space, I was beginning to understand, is not always absence. Sometimes it is the beginning of something that hasn't formed yet. That night, a thought came without resistance. It did not feel forced. It did not feel emotional. It felt simple. I had spent a long time defining my life through what I thought was missing. But I had rarely defined it through what I had still been able to carry, even in silence. Resilience, adaptation, quiet endurance, presence in spaces that did not always reflect back what I expected. That realization did not erase sadness, but it changed its position inside me. It was no longer the only lens. And that shift mattered more than I could explain in words. The next day, I returned again. But this time, something was different in a way I could not immediately describe. It wasn't external. It was internal alignment. I no longer felt like I was entering a place to observe life. I felt like I was part of a shared environment that did not require constant emotional justification. I sat down, and for the first time, I didn't immediately search for meaning in everything I saw. I simply allowed things to exist as they were. And in that allowing, I noticed something surprising. The more I stopped searching for meaning, the more naturally meaning appeared in small fragments. Not as answers, but as experiences. A brief exchange of support. A shared pause. A moment of mutual attention that didn't need to be defined. I left earlier that day, not because I needed to escape, but because I felt no urgency to stay longer. That itself felt new. Not attachment, Not avoidance, just balance. On the way home, I realized something quietly significant. I was no longer living entirely inside the narrative of what had not happened in my life. I was beginning to also notice what was still happening around me and within me in real time. That does not erase the past, but it creates a second layer of awareness that changes how the past sits inside you. That night, I didn't reflect deeply. I didn't analyze. I simply rested in the fact that something in me was no longer stuck in a single direction. And for the first time in a long while, that felt like movement forward, not away from anything, but toward something still forming. Something about that sense of movement stayed with me longer than expected. Not as excitement, not as hope in a loud or emotional way, but as quiet awareness that my inner world was no longer fixed in one emotional position. That realization did not arrive fully formed. It unfolded slowly, in fragments, through ordinary moments that I initially would have overlooked. Like the way I began to notice pauses in my own thinking before reacting. Or how I found myself no longer rushing to assign meaning to every feeling immediately. There was a growing space between experience and interpretation. And in that space, I was beginning to breathe differently. The center had become a familiar part of my weeks now, but I had stopped seeing it as something separate from my life. It was no longer another place I go. It had become part of a broader pattern of awareness that was developing in me. One afternoon, I arrived and found the room unusually calm. Not empty, just settled. The kind of calm that does not feel like absence of activity, but rather activity in its natural rhythm. I sat down and noticed how quickly my body adjusted now. There was less resistance in me when entering spaces that were not fully mine. That itself felt like a quiet change I could not ignore. I observed for a while, without actively focusing on anything specific. That kind of attention had once felt impossible for me. My mind used to constantly search for emotional meaning, almost as if silence itself needed to be explained. But now, I was learning that not everything requires interpretation in the moment. Some things are meant to be experienced first, understood later, or sometimes simply left as they are. At one point, I noticed a small interaction happening near the side of the room. Nothing dramatic, just a moment of attention shifting between two people in a way that felt natural and unforced. There was no tension in it, no expectation, just presence responding to presence. And I realized how rare it was for me, in earlier years, to experience presence without internal analysis. I had often filtered everything through emotional consequence. What does this mean? What should I feel? What does it say about me? But now, I was beginning to experience moments without immediately translating them. That shift felt subtle, but important, because it meant I was no longer constantly turning outward experience into inward pressure. When I left that day, I did not carry emotional heaviness with me, but I also did not feel detached. It was something more balanced, a kind of quiet continuity between what I had experienced inside and what I was returning to outside. On the walk home, I noticed how ordinary everything felt again, but in a different way than before. Not dull, not overwhelming, just present. And I realized I was no longer splitting my life into meaningful spaces and empty spaces as sharply as I used to. That division had been dissolving without me forcing it. At home, I sat near the window as I often did, but this time my thoughts did not immediately rush toward the past. Instead, they stayed closer to the present. And in that present, I noticed something I had not fully acknowledged before. I was no longer only living in relation to what I had lost or what had not happened. I was beginning to live in relation to what was still unfolding. Not in a dramatic sense, but in a continuous, quiet sense. That recognition did not remove sadness completely, but it changed its dominance. It was no longer the central frame of everything, just one part of a wider internal landscape. The next day, I returned again. And something different happened, not externally, but in how I moved through the space. I was no longer entering cautiously. I was no longer measuring my emotional distance from everything around me. I simply entered, and sat, and observed, without resistance, without expectation. There was a moment during that visit when I realized I had stopped waiting for something specific to happen in order for the experience to feel meaningful. Meaning was no longer something I was waiting to receive. It was something I was noticing in fragments as it appeared, and then letting it pass. That shift was quiet, but deeply significant, because it meant I was no longer living in constant emotional anticipation. I was beginning to inhabit the present without demanding it prove itself. When I left that day, I felt something I had not felt in a long time in a stable way. Not joy, not completion, but continuity. A sense that I was no longer disconnected from my own experience. And for now, that was enough to keep me moving forward without needing to define exactly where I was going. The feeling of continuity did not stay perfect. It never does. There were still moments when the old silence returned with its familiar weight, as if reminding me that it had not disappeared, only stepped back for a while. But even those returns were different now. They did not take over everything the way they once did. They came, stayed briefly, and then receded again into the background of a life that was no longer built entirely around them. That change was not something I had forced. It had developed slowly, almost quietly, through repetition of small shifts in attention and experience. I continued visiting the center, but by now it felt less like a place I was going to, and more like a rhythm that existed alongside my life. Something I could step into and out of without emotional disruption. That stability itself felt unfamiliar at first. Because for so long, my emotional world had been defined by extremes, either heavy absence or tightly controlled functioning. There had been very little in between. Now, I was beginning to understand what in between actually felt like. One afternoon, I arrived during a quieter period again. The light in the room was softer, angled differently than before, creating long, gentle shapes across the floor. I sat down and noticed something simple. I was not scanning the space for emotional meaning immediately anymore. My attention arrived more naturally now. It didn't rush. It didn't search. It simply observed. That alone would have once felt impossible for me. I remember there was a moment when I caught myself thinking, not about what I lacked, but about how my perception itself had changed over time. Not everything had changed outside me, but the way I experienced things had shifted enough that the same environment no longer produced the same emotional reaction. That realization was quietly powerful, because it meant I was no longer fully trapped inside my earlier emotional patterns. They still existed, but they no longer defined every response. During that visit, I noticed something small again. A brief exchange of attention between individuals that carried no urgency, no tension, no explanation. It was simple, almost invisible if you weren't paying attention. But I was noticing it now. Not because I was searching for meaning, but because I was present enough to recognize it when it appeared. And that difference mattered. When I left that day, I didn't carry emotional weight with me in the same way I once did. There was still depth in me, still memory, still layers of feeling that had not vanished. But they were no longer pressing against every moment of my awareness. On the walk home, I found myself thinking less and observing more. The world around me felt less like something I was separated from, and more like something I was moving through alongside. That distinction felt important, because for a long time, I had felt like life was happening around me while I remained slightly outside of it. Now, that distance was no longer fixed. At home, I noticed something else. My evenings were no longer dominated by internal repetition of the same thoughts. There was still reflection, but it was not compulsive anymore. It did not circle endlessly. It arrived, stayed briefly, and then moved on. That change created a kind of mental space I had not experienced in years. And in that space, something unexpected began to form. Not hope in the way I once imagined it, but something more grounded. A recognition that my life was not static. It was still unfolding, even in ways I had not predicted or planned. The next day, I returned again. But this time, I noticed something different in myself even before I entered the space. I was not preparing emotionally, in advance. I was not bracing. I was simply arriving. And that arrival felt less like stepping into a separate world, and more like continuing something already in motion. Inside, I sat down as usual. But my attention did not immediately lock onto anything specific. Instead, it moved gently, allowing the environment to exist without demanding interpretation. At one point, I realized I was no longer measuring myself against the life I thought I should have had. That comparison had been quietly loosening its grip over time, without me fully noticing. It was still there in traces, but it no longer defined my emotional baseline. And that change, though subtle, was significant, because it meant I was no longer living in constant negotiation with an imagined version of my life. I was beginning to engage with the life I actually had. Not perfectly, not completely, but more honestly than before. When I left that day, I felt something that stayed with me through the evening. A quiet sense of internal alignment, not because everything was resolved, but because I was no longer resisting my own presence in my life as much as I once did. There was still sadness inside me. There were still unanswered parts. But they no longer stood alone. They were now part of a broader, more layered experience of being. And for the first time in a long while, I did not feel like I was waiting for my life to begin. I felt like I was already inside it. The realization that I was already inside my life did not arrive with celebration. It arrived quietly, almost unnoticeably, as something that simply stopped feeling untrue. And that is how most real changes happen. Not through declaration, but through the gradual disappearance of resistance. There were still days when old thoughts returned with familiar intensity. Days when silence felt heavier again, when memory pressed closer, when the question of what was missing briefly regained its sharpness. But those days no longer defined the entire structure of my inner world. They passed through me, now instead of settling inside me. And that difference slowly began to reshape everything. I continued my visits, but my relationship with the space had evolved again. It was no longer something I analyzed emotionally upon entry, nor something I used to measure my own healing. It had become part of a broader rhythm of awareness that was extending into other areas of my life. One afternoon, I arrived during a transitional hour. The space was neither busy nor quiet in a defined way. It was in motion, soft, continuous, unforced. I sat down and noticed how little effort it took now for me to simply be there. Earlier, I had always been slightly aware of myself in relation to everything else. Now that awareness had softened, not disappeared, just softened. At one point, I realized I was observing without inner commentary. That used to be rare for me. My mind had always tried to interpret everything immediately, as if understanding needed to happen in real time for experience to be valid. But now, experience was beginning to exist without that constant translation. And that made space for something else. Presence. Not dramatic presence, just simple awareness of what is. During that visit, I noticed something I would have previously overlooked entirely. A moment of stillness in the middle of activity, where nothing needed to be explained or directed. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it stayed with me, because I understood now that life, is not only made of major moments. It is also made of these small pauses where everything simply exists without tension. When I left that day, I felt neither heavy nor light. I felt steady. And steadiness was something I had not always recognized as valuable. I used to believe emotional intensity meant depth. But now I was beginning to see that steadiness can also hold depth, just in a quieter form. On the walk home, I noticed something new again. My thoughts were no longer constantly circling around absence. They were beginning to include other dimensions of experience. What I was noticing, what I was learning, how I was changing in ways that did not always feel dramatic, but were consistent. At home, I sat and realized that my evenings had changed shape without me deliberately altering them. They were no longer defined by internal struggle or avoidance. They had become more reflective than reactive. And reflection, I was learning, is very different from rumination. Reflection expands. Rumination traps. The difference between them is subtle but life-changing. That night, I thought about how long I had lived in a version of myself that was defined almost entirely by what had not happened. Not out of choice, but out of habit. And I realized that habit had slowly been loosening its structure without me forcing it. The next day, I returned again. But something inside me felt different before I even entered. Not anticipation. Not hesitation. Just continuity. As if there was no sharp boundary anymore between outside and inside versions of my experience. Inside, I sat down and found that I was no longer looking for emotional validation in what I saw. I was simply observing what was there. And that simplicity felt surprisingly full. Not empty. Full. Because I was no longer dividing my attention between what I was experiencing and what I thought it meant about me. That division had softened. And in that softening, something new had become possible. I began to understand that my life had not been waiting to be fixed. It had been waiting to be fully seen. Not through judgment, but through presence. When I left that day, I did something I had not done in a long time. I walked without trying to analyze my emotional state. I did not categorize it. I did not measure it. I simply allowed it to exist as part of me without needing to define it immediately. And that, more than anything, felt like progress. Not because everything had changed, but because my relationship to everything was no longer the same. And for now, that was enough. Enough to keep moving forward without needing the past to disappear. Enough to keep living without waiting for life to finally begin. Because somewhere along the way, I had stopped waiting and started noticing that I was already here. The final shift did not announce itself. It did not arrive like a turning point or a dramatic realization. It came in the way most real changes do, quietly, through repetition, until one day I simply noticed that something old no longer defined me in the same way. There were still memories. There was still grief in places I could not fully erase. But it no longer sat at the center of everything I experienced. It had moved. Not disappeared. Moved. That difference changed how I lived more than I could have predicted. I continued my visits, but even those no longer felt like part of a journey toward healing. That idea had slowly dissolved. Instead, they had become part of ordinary life. Not extraordinary. Not symbolic. Just present. One afternoon, I arrived and noticed how natural everything felt. Not because the world around me had changed, but because my internal resistance had softened so much that I was no longer interpreting everything through the lens of absence. I sat down, and for a long time I did not try to understand anything. I did not search for meaning. I did not measure emotional distance. I simply observed. And in that observation, I noticed something simple but profound. I was no longer outside my own life. There was no longer that constant sense of watching from a distance, as if everything meaningful belonged somewhere else. It was here now. Not perfect, not resolved, but here. That realization did not create overwhelming emotion. It created quiet acceptance. And acceptance, I was learning, is not an ending. It is a form of continuity, without resistance. On the way home that day, I noticed the world differently again. Not because it had changed, but because I had stopped separating myself from it so sharply. The streets, the movement, the ordinary passing of time, they no longer felt like something I was excluded from. They felt like something I was part of, even if my story inside them had taken a different shape than I once imagined. At home, I sat by the window like I often did. But this time, I wasn't searching for meaning. And meaning still arrived. Not in answers, but in clarity. I understood, finally, that my life had never been only about what was missing. It had also been about what I survived internally, without even recognizing it. The years of carrying silence. The years of continuing to show up for others while holding my own quiet ache. The years of learning how to function while still feeling deeply. That was not emptiness. That was endurance. And endurance is also a form of life. As I sat there, I felt something settle inside me that I had not felt before in this way. Not closure in a dramatic sense, but release of constant internal tension. The need to define everything was gone. The need to compare my life to an imagined version of it had softened. Even the need to constantly understand myself had quieted. I was simply here, and being here was enough. I did not imagine sudden happiness. I did not imagine a perfect future replacing everything before it. Life does not reorganize itself that cleanly. But I did feel something steady forming beneath everything else. A kind of grounded acceptance that did not rely on circumstances changing to exist. That evening, I did not replay the past in the same way I once did. I did not search for meaning in what was lost. Instead, I noticed something new. The present had started to feel spacious enough to hold both memory and movement at the same time. Not in conflict, but in coexistence. And that changed everything. Because for so long, I had believed I had to choose between who I was and what I had lost. Now I understood I could carry both, without being defined entirely by either. The final truth was not dramatic. It was simple. My life had not been delayed. It had been unfolding in ways I did not recognize while I was waiting for a different version of it. And now, I was no longer waiting. I was participating. Not perfectly, not completely, but genuinely. And in that participation, something that resembled peace began to exist, not as a destination, but as a way of being present without resistance. The story did not end with everything becoming perfect. It ended with something quieter. A woman who once felt defined by absence learning to recognize presence again. And in that recognition, discovering that even empty arms can still hold a life that continues to grow.